Hey, look at this. Look what I got. 2 monster manuals in the mail, and I'm going to talk about the big takeaways I have about the 2025 monster manual for the 2024 edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Last time I was talking about how the monster manual's math works, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for all the really cool comments about it. That took a lot of work to compile all of that, and I'm still working through it, doing some other comparisons. There were some great questions about things like, do monsters have more resistances and vulnerabilities, and what do exact monsters compare like DPR-wise? And so I'm actually working through all that, and there'll be another video that'll get back into that math piece. But for this video, I really wanted to talk about just stepping back. What's this book feel like? What's great about it? Where does it maybe fall short in my overall assessment? And I'm just going to start with the overall assessment right now, which is that this is a great book. It's a really good book. It's better than solid. Overall improves on the monsters. Doesn't always do what I want it to do, but it's overall a really great book that is improving the monsters. It is stepping back from some of the experiments they did that were maybe not as great, and coming in and getting a little closer to the 2014 design. So overall, this is a great book. I like what it's doing here. I think these are fun monsters, better monsters than 2014. Nothing in that's going to mean that you don't still want to get yourself a copy of Forge of Foes to make your monsters even cooler. Product placement. But it is a great improvement, a solid improvement over 2014. I do recommend picking up this book, and let's look at why. Jumping into the introduction, this book starts with a pretty solid walkthrough what the stat block looks like. It kind of uses the format that's in the Player's Handbook and in the Dungeon Master's Guide with like an example, in this case of the Vampire Familiar, and it gives you like little numbers, you know, like, so you can see like 1 and 2 and what they mean, and it talks through what all of that does. You know, it's just a good overview of how to use these monsters, how to make use of the stat blocks. After that, you get a breakdown of both the write-up and the sections in the write-up for each monster, like that it'll have a habitat section and what that means, even if it's really, really short, or what it means with multi-attack or gear. And those two really stuck out at me. Those are the ones that I really noted. So gear, it says monsters have proficiency with their equipment. If they have equipment that can be given away or retrieved, that's when it shows up in the gear entry. Some folks wondered if it meant that you had a limited number of shots or things like that, but it's really about what can be reclaimed. And they make the point that the stat block can have what they call flourishes that make it more effective or different than typical gear that you'd find in the Player's Handbook or some other source. That flourish type stuff that you see in the power, like if it deals cold damage or returns when thrown, that does not transfer when it is recovered as gear. So I thought that was interesting, that idea that it really is about what's sort of left behind. Very few monsters do that. So it's sort of strange, like you kill the Vampire Familiar, I think it is, and it has like 10, it has an Umbral Dagger attack, and its gear is 10 daggers. You just get 10 daggers. You don't get special Umbral Daggers that deal necrotic or return when thrown or anything like that. So, you know, that's fine. It's okay. Nothing big there. Then the part here that I found interesting on multi-attack is that it just kind of says, hey, when you have take the attack action, you can take more than one attack. And there are a couple of examples here in the book where I had the question about the order in which things happen. Not the order of attacks. So they're generally pretty good in the book of saying, like, you have these 2 attacks, you know, let's say axe or sword in any order. So usually that's pretty well done. So the Primeval Owlbear is a great example of this. It says if the target is a huge or smaller creature and the owlbear moved 20 plus feet straight toward it immediately before the hit, the target takes an extra 9 slashing damage and has the prone condition. Okay, but I get to do 2 of these attacks. So I move, let's say 20 feet. I hit with the first of my multi-attacks. For sure, that's going to be an extra 9 slashing, and it's going to have the prone condition. Now I get my second attack. Did I fulfill the obligation of moving 20 plus feet straight toward it immediately before the hit? I can certainly make a call, but I would like the rule to make a call for everybody, and there is nothing that's telling me this. So either the text of the owlbear needs to tell me, or the multi-attack should have told me that it fulfills, that if there is a condition, the multi-attack is considered to fulfill it for all of its iterations, or that it's not, and it doesn't tell me. Now let's jump into the stat block changes. And here there are a number of interesting differences that are taking place that they have done to reorganize the stat block. At first glance, what's really going to stick out is going to be the abilities and saving throws. And if you've seen any of the new monsters, you see what that looks like. You get these big blocks like you're seeing here in this example that I'm going to show you with the coolest monster in the book, the Flumph, obviously. So, you can see that there are these large blocks of color with the pluses. I don't love this from a layout perspective. I don't think that if you're going to make one thing on the page really jump out at you, that this is what should have jumped out. To me, that would be something like the to hit roll, the bonus that's on attacks, or the DCs of saving throws, or damage. Those are things that I'm always like, where is that? Right? I'm looking for that on the page. I am not wildly looking for the saving throws. Those only come up every now and then. Be fine if you wanted to do something subtle with them, but making them jump out this much, okay. and I just don't think layout-wise it's particularly pretty. But hey, we have this information and our brains will learn to parse it just fine, I'm sure. Things that are really cool is having the initiative bonus right there. I think that's really awesome. It's really helpful to see the initiative spelled out versus having to go to the stat block and break that out. Okay, dex, blah, right? That's really nice. The proficiency bonus is a little hidden. Like I might have brought that up, but it's fine. You can find it. They list XP, which I don't think you need both CR and XP. I'm usually not working that off of the stat block, so just get that off the screen so I don't need to worry about it. Get it off the stat block. There's a table in the book that tells you what each CR gives you in terms of XP. So I didn't really need that, but that's fine, no biggie. And then to me, a very big thing is undoing some of the things that the team tried to do in the Monsters of the Multiverse book and really talked about being the way forward. And I'm going to talk about some things that they said that were great that I wish they'd gone forward with further. But one thing they did was they tended to have, in many monsters in the Multiverse book, they took monsters that were like in Volos and Mordenkainens and redid them with changes like every alignment saying typically lawful evil. And you can see with the example I'm showing you of the Skull Lord. So the Skull Lord is this is a picture from the Multiverse book. And there are a couple of things that are interesting. One thing is it says typically lawful evil. And I find this to be sort of, I don't know what you're telling me. Is it sometimes good? Is it anything? Are you just telling me that monsters can have exceptions? Because I know that. Like I had a lawful good beholder in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that actually TPK'd my party. So it goes. Misunderstandings, But I didn't need this typically next to alignments. And I'm glad to see those are gone. So it just tells me in the beginning of the monster manual that alignments are typical for the type of creature and that there are exceptions to all of them. And that especially neutral is something you can look at as really changing a lot. Cool. The other thing you'll see is at the very bottom, there's this unusual nature trait that takes up, 2 lines plus the little spacing. And it says the Skull Lord doesn't require air, food, drink, or sleep. Yeah, it's like a skeleton, right? Like I wasn't really worried about this. You didn't need to spell it out. And now it's another trait that I'm trying to figure out and looking at the stat block and just makes life confusing. So those are gone, right? This is the Masters of the Multiverse example. When we look at 2025, the Skull Lord isn't in there, but if we look at a skeleton or a zombie, we see that it doesn't have that. It's not burdened by it, which allows a pretty simple monster like the skeleton or zombie to keep being simple. And that's the whole point of not telling me it doesn't need to breathe or sleep. Yeah, right? And in fact, if you want to tell me those things in a way that maybe isn't obvious, like skeleton, put it in the lore to the side, right? Something like that, then that's fine. But and the other thing is I would just expect in general, all undead are going to do these things. And I'd rather you tell me about it with the undead type. And then if there's an exception, you tell me in the lore for that monster. So, but overall, stat block changes, pretty positive. I like what's being done here. And a really nice thing about the book is that it generally has a simplified approach towards monster attacks and actions. There is usually a melee and ranged attack. Sometimes it's the same thing. So they'll have a spear and they can throw it and it returns to them, or they can stab with it. And it just lets you do what you want to do as a DM, which is attack this thing and not worry about ammo, not worry about whether it's effective at range, whether it's effective in melee. And in 2014, we had some monsters that I think, in trying to establish verisimilitude, right, to make it feel like it's real, it would give a, maybe it's an archer, so therefore its bow attack is really great, and its melee would be something kind of lame. And then the problem is the PCs would run up to it and be face stabbing at it, and it can do back anything useful. And so your monster just ended up being ineffective. When really what it should have is the ability, you're going to use it primarily as an archer. And hey, when it's in close combat, then, it's just not doing that, right? Or maybe it has a way to get away, but not to make it so that it just has no teeth if it's in the wrong position. Or even worse, when there were monsters that had no ranged attack at all, like the Tarrasque. And so then they just couldn't do anything when the party played keep away. And that was a big problem. So they have taken care of those kinds of situations, and they've often simplified it into a single attack that does both things. So you're just not even worrying about it a whole lot. Every now and then there's a difference in terms of conditions. So what you'll find is something like, I can hit you with my axe, or let's say hit you with my hammer and knock you prone, or I can shoot you with my dagger, and when I throw my dagger at you, it's just damage. And maybe the knocking prone actually does a little less damage because I'm also knocking you prone. So we see some math that's there because a condition is being added. Something I haven't done, but I would love to do if I had even more time than I've spent on my monster spreadsheets, is to really look at every time there's a condition, is there a consistent amount of damage that's being subtracted for knocking prone or poison condition or anything like that? I suspect there kind of is, but it's hard to tell. And it's hard to tell because I don't also know the bands the way in the 2014 DMG or 2014 DMG, it would tell us here's the expected damage band. Then you could see what a monster is doing. And I think it's still the same damage bands if you watch my last video, but it's hard to tell. So, it'll take some additional work to get there. And maybe that's something I can look at for the future. But point being, you will see this kind of variation sometimes, but it's still pretty simple. It's like attack 1, attack 2, or just one attack to cover the ranged and the melee. The next thing you'll often see for many of the monsters is an area of effect options, something that goes out. It's a cone, it's an emanation out of it, it's a burst it can lob, something like that, so that it can get a variety of targets. And as I mentioned in the last video, the damage per round that you do when you calculate a typical, as it's done for design for Dungeons & Dragons, a 3-round combat for this creature, we find that AoE is often really strong, even if we stick to 2 targets as the number of creatures that are in the area of effect. That area of effect still often qualifies as sort of a punch up statistically, rather than being the exact same damage. And that's, I think, because when we hear designers say that they have tried to create a more stable approach, that any path leads to the DPR or leads to the CR that you of the monster, right? They are expecting that this is obvious. Like, that if it has a 5 and 6 recharge to do a cone of fire, it's going to do that. Like, you're not going to miss that. It's not a trick to see it. So I think they're expecting that, and they're expecting that little punch up that comes from that. Now, if we look at more than 2 targets for area of effect, which is often happening, like you have an emanation that's 100 feet, everybody within 100 feet. Yeah, you're getting the whole party with that. Then that damage actually can really climb. And so it makes it important as a DM to know that. Something we don't find in this book is sort of tactical how-to information on how to run a monster. And because this book was written after the Dungeon Master's Guide, you don't find that in the Dungeon Master's Guide either in terms of really tactics. And so maybe one of the things I'll look at in the future is a how-to on running these monsters. And one of those things is that your area of effect is often really important. And while they give you a little bit of tactical here where they say, like, make sure to use it, essentially that most monsters will use their recharge abilities as soon as possible. Yeah, that's good because in terms of before the party might stop you from doing that or kill you. But there's also that tactical advantage of, can you get everybody in this area of effect? And so understanding how many things you probably want to get, 3 in a fireball, not 2, right? Or 4 if you can. And so if you think you can wait that round and get another person in it, your effectiveness as a combatant goes way up. And so it can be worth doing that. The other thing is, if a monster has a fireball and they can be, if they have reason to be part of an ambush situation or attack in a place that creates a bottleneck, huge effective increase, right? Increase to its effectiveness. As an example of this, we can look at the Aarakocra Aeromancer. Very first monster in the book. It's a new creature. So we still have the old Aarakocra, which is the Aarakocra Skirmisher now. I'll talk about conversions in a bit. So it's CR4. It has a multi-attack. It can attack twice with Wind Staff. And that Wind Staff, as you see, can be melee or ranged for 7 bludgeoning and 11 lightning. And that's also very typical that we see this dual type of damage where one type is kind of helping to flavor the attack. It's a little more math. We got to go, okay, 7 plus 11, 18. Cool. But you know what? It helps you flavor it. If you don't mind writing in your books, I don't. I think that's for heathens. But if you think it's cool, we'll just go ahead and write an 18 next to your monster, right? And just be done with it. Or print them out like I probably would. So that's really great, but it's not the only thing this monster can do. It can, with its multi-attack, choose to swap in, or it can, in this case, it's not even swapping in. It can cast Gust of Wind. Some monsters swap things in, but here it just lets you cast Gust of Wind, which is cool because it's kind of tactical and flavor rather than being damage. So I really love that. It just does this as part of it, really gets into that Aeromancer aspect and flying creature kind of thing. Then in addition to this, it has the spellcasting block, and that has a lot of utility here. So Elementalism, Gust of Wind, Mage Hand, Message, all at will. And then once per day, Lightning Bolt. And that's where we get into one of the things that's a little bit of an interesting conundrum in this 2025 Monster Manual, which is the approach to spellcasting they take. I'll talk a little bit about that more, but I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. But this creates a choice, right? Do you want to multi-attack for 36 damage a round? Or do you want a lightning bolt for, well, if you get 2 targets, 43 damage. So that's a spike, as we said. Or 52 if you can hit 3 targets in that 100-foot line. And you are a flying creature, so you should be able to line that up to get 3 targets. That is very important to understand that difference, right? 52 versus 36 in a round is huge in terms of the effectiveness, because this is probably not the only monster there. So, you know, there's a lot going on there. This really ups the threat of the monster. So you can see this sets up a 3-round cadence. You're going to use your area of effect once. You're going to use multi-attack probably in the other 2 rounds, unless you get lucky on the refresh. And so that's the way this monster is working. And this is pretty typical of how these monsters are working. Now, some monsters are a lot simpler. The Flumph, we've got our Lawful Good Small Aberration. It can fly. It has a hover capability, so it can't be knocked prone and flying. It has advanced telepathy. It has a problem when it's prone. And it can't be detected telepathically or through magic. So it has a very simple action stat block. It has a tentacle that it hits, but +4 to attack for 4 damage. And it has a stench spray once per day. This is not area effect. It's one creature the Flumph can see within 15 feet, coats you in foul-smelling liquid, and you have the poison condition, and other creatures are poisoned when they're near it, which is one of the things that you always struggle with the Flumph, is how do you capture that original Fiend Folio book flavor back in 1st edition, where it said that nobody wanted to be near the creature that had been squirted on. So this is how it does it, because you're going to be poisoned while you're next to the target that was coated in stench spray. There's no recharge. It's just once per day. And then the rest of this is really lore, right? We get information on what they're like, and we get a table. There are a number of tables in the books that in this book that says things like, and here the Flumph helps by, and we get 6 reasons. So it's going to cook a meal for you. It's going to serve as a guide. It's going to reveal the location of magic items. I find these tables okay. If you watch the Mastering Dungeons podcast and you listen to the episode where we talk about the Monster Overhaul book, I think those tables are far superior to the ones that are in this monster manual. These are okay, but they're kind of just interesting ideas that, honestly, I think if the lore were written a little more interestingly, I could pick that up off the lore. But I know a lot of people really love tables, so if you do, you may really enjoy the fact that they did more tables in this book than they did in the 2014 edition, which there were some. There are also more quotes, which there also were quotes in the old one. So you get a little more of that. The attempt to simplify has also led to a number of monsters being reworked to try to make how they work be a little smoother and a little fairer, a little more around what is expected out of the monster. So for example, in 2014, the Tentacle attack, the same attack bonus as in 2025, it does a little less damage, and then you have to make a saving throw to see if you are stunned. In 2025, it deals a little more damage, and you are grappled and stunned until the grapple ends. As a separate action, so there is no multi-attack, but as a separate action, the Mind Flayer can do Extract Brain, and that is a saving throw, and you take either 55 damage or half, and if that kills you, your brain has been devoured. Whereas in the old version, you took the same amount of damage automatically on a hit, no save for half. So it was a little more dangerous, but it was also an attack versus a saving throw. So it was a different kind of mechanic and a little harder to set up, I think. And here, it's more often that you're doing something, but there is that chance to only have had half damage or to save, more ways to maybe impact it, and you may not lose your brain this way. In 2014, the Mind Blast, in this 60-foot cone, you made your saving throw, and if you succeeded, you're fine. But if you failed, you took damage and you were stunned. Now, the damage is a little higher, and if you succeed, you take half damage. And if you failed, you're stunned, but only until the end of their next turn. So that sets up Extract Brain as well as a possibility, or takes people out. But isn't the sort of thing where if you are just rolling poorly round after round, as I've seen happen at the table, everybody's just sitting there stunned and can't do anything, and it's just a TPK situation. So this has backed off a bit to make it a little more reliable. The damage has gone up in some places. The threat has subdued down to be more reasonable in others, right? It's a smoothing of it so that overall it should feel a little simpler in how it executes. The team really worked on trying to make it so that no matter what you do with the monster, you'll get to the same CR, as I mentioned a bit ago. And this is generally true. It's a big step forward compared to the 2014 monsters, both in the Monster Manual and in other books. But there are issues, as I said, around area of effect attacks. Like it's important as a DM to recognize how effective those are, and that those tend to be a little more damage, especially if you can get more than 2 targets. And spell casting. Spell casting to make it tricky so that you are not sure whether that will hit the expected DPR, and often it doesn't. I may go into more detail in another video on how to make the most of this, but in particular, you have to go and look up and see what the spellcasting options are like to see whether they're effective or not, and that takes research time. Or you can just say, well, I'm not going to look it up. But the problem is, one time you might look up, say, Flame Strike, and find out that this monster should not use Flame Strike. It's just better off doing its Rend attack. And then the next time, the Flame Strike is actually a big spike in damage, and that other monster, you absolutely should use Flame Strike for that monster. So it's not even just spell dependent. You know, it's dependent on the CR of the overall creature and what its other multi-attack does, whether you should use this Flame Strike in its stat block or not. So even when you know a spell, you may need to look it up. And the spells are often upcast, and that means you need to know what was the original spell level, what did it do in its original state, how can you scale it. So there's just a lot of looking up of those spells to see what the paths to CR may be. You also have to look and be careful about whether something is setting up a situation, right? One power does this, the other one piggybacks off of that and is better because of that, right? Like something will knock them prone, and then now you get to do a bunch of attacks. Well, those are going to be an advantage. So that's where you want to know that your melee attacker should do this sequence, right? But in general, more paths lead to CR. And if you don't do it exactly the optimal way, you'll probably be a lot closer than you would have been before. There's been a big change to how monster types are handled in the Monster Manual. In the 2014 Monster Manual, there are a number of humanoids that are creatures that we kind of tend to, in classical D&D, we tended to just wipe them out. But Dungeons & Dragons back then was pretty different, right? There was a lot more of just clear out this room, stab the monsters in the face, take their treasure. It doesn't matter what they are. And you're just having fun with seeing what they are and discovering it. And as play has evolved, that the character of that play, the type of play being created has changed to allow for a little more of the, what is the story of these creatures? What's going on here? Recognizing these as peoples with stories, with interesting culture and aspects. And that means that sometimes murdering them is not appropriate. And what we've often found is there can be a lot of fun off of that, right? Because we find out that our backstory can link to the monsters we're fighting. Our monsters can become allies or friends. If you played the Acquisitions Incorporated adventure that's over there, I can't point that way. Hey, there, over there. You can find numerous examples where the monsters can be just as fun to bring into your organization than it is to murder them. So in this book, they've made a real concerted change to look at a number of monsters and change their type. Goblins become Fae, right? Which makes them a little more fickle, a little more wild, and maybe why they can be attacked more readily is because they are in this kind of Fae type that are a little more of raw entities and chaotic elements than they are humanoids, but it's questionable. Orcs don't appear at all, which actually, a lot of creatures did not appear. So things that were playable races did not appear in 2014, where you didn't see an elf entry, but you did see a drow entry, and now you don't. Because again, drow are seen increasingly as being something that isn't just inherently in its stat block something we attack. I think that's the mentality here, which I can largely buy into. But there are some places here where it falls short. And let me just go ahead and share what this looks like, because we get a conversion document that's helpful to illustrate these. So you can see here this appendix, and it gives us conversions. So some of them, these are just pretty simple, like the Aarakocra, which was the first creature in the last book. There's now a new one, like I shared, but there's also the old one has just become the Aarakocra Skirmisher. That doesn't mean its stat block didn't change, but that is like the equivalent, right? And sometimes this is we took the old Aarakocra, we tweaked it, it's the Aarakocra Skirmisher. That's your conversion. And sometimes it is, we took the Drow Elite Warrior and kind of it went away. We already had a gladiator before. That gladiator is the gladiator. The Drow Elite Warrior is also the gladiator. So it kind of went away, right? But I guess they looked at it as sort of converting it in addition. So 2 monsters became 1, right? Overall, we got more monsters in this monster manual, but some of them did, in fact, kind of go away, or at least became a dual conversion into 1, if that makes sense. So we see here like things like the Orc Eye of Grumsh, the Orc War Chief, those actually become other monsters, the Tough, the Cultist Fanatic, the Tough Boss, right? But we can also find other examples where things have changed in interesting ways. And one of them is the Lizard Folk. So Lizard Folk, all of their stats are pointed to something else. In the Monster Manual 25, we get 2 Lizard Folk that are totally different stat blocks that are in addition to these, or, it sort of depends on how you want to look at it. So I think what they're saying here is if you wanted to run what is sort of a typical Lizard Folk here, you can do so by using the Scout. As I said before, in general, I'm in favor of what's going on here. I think this is a good experiment to try to move us forward in terms of how we approach groups of peoples, cultures, and so on to make interesting play. I think that there is a place where we're losing some, not just verisimilitude, but like interest level that we can have in play, right? The same reason for that we may want the Frost Giant to not just be 2 boring axe attacks or chucking a rock, and we want it to deal cold damage and to have this rallying cry that it now has. I also don't really want to run the Scout and say, oh, that's a Lizard Folk, because what makes it a Lizard Folk in that Scout stat block? Probably not a lot. So tell me what Lizard Folk are like in terms of a combat interaction, and can we have that be part of it, right? More than just being amphibious, which the Scout isn't. Like adding something in there. 4th edition was really good at doing this, right? It would have things like all goblins had the shifty trait, right? And that was really neat to know that they kind of retreat away from you as part of their combat. That was really neat. And other monsters had that as well. So, that's a case where you may want to use these conversions and then add in some monster powers from Forge of Foes, because it lets you do that, right? And I hope to be able to help with this in the future, let's say. Ooh, what's he talking about? Anyway, overall, these stat block conversions are fine. It's not a big deal. You've got tons of monsters here. It's a lot of fun. And all monster stat blocks are kind of like sleight of hand, right? We're taking a bunch of numbers and saying, oh, this is this creature. And everybody goes, yeah. Because what? Because the Dungeon Master describes it as such. And we have had many 2014 monsters that were really quite boring and plain that everybody thought was whatever the DM said it was, because the DM did a good job of that. And that is still true today. We didn't lose a ton here. Generally, we gain more than we might have lost here. I think any person will have some quibbles with this approach. But overall, it's probably fine. And the changes to types, I think, are overall fine, even positive. And I think going forward through this to find a really nice way to be here is better than not going here, if that makes sense. There are also some things here that are just funny. Like, if in 2014 we're like, what's a quipper? A quipper? Swarm equippers? And then now it's piranha again. I don't know. So why? I don't know. Let's quickly focus a bit on spell lists, which I brought up before, but there are a number of monsters here that use spell lists. And I think this was a big question for a lot of folks, designers. I know all of my friends who are designers were wondering about this. How would 2025 compare to the 2014 approach? And there are improvements, but not quite as far as we could have wanted. And if you think about monsters of the multiverse, when they sort of tweaked the monster approach, one of the things that came out in a blog was this idea of, hey, a spell list is going to be a list of utility non-combat spells. If there is an offensive spell you're supposed to use, it will be in the stat block. This led to some criticism because we saw sort of a pseudo fireball appear in a stat block that couldn't be counterspelled, wasn't really fireball, but was basically fireball. And then we also saw some examples that still had like an offensive spell in the spell list. And that felt a little off, right, to some people. Me, personally, I would just like to see fireball in the spell block. If it's important, put it in the stat block, put it in an action, and tell me what it does in a quick summary way. And use the same name fireball, because you know what? I can look it up if I want to. Most monsters that will use spells offensively have two options, right? It'll be something like one or two. So it'll be something like, hey, it can rend and it can throw in Guiding Bolt. The gold dragon we saw did that, right? Cool. So that gives me a neat option. And I can look up Guiding Bolt and see what it does. But even better would be if you just told me what Guiding Bolt does. It's just one quick spell you could tell me, right? It does blah damage and advantage on my next attack. Get it over with, right? Then in what we also see here are monsters that have like two things, like Lightning Bolt and Firebolt. Every now and then something, I think the Lich is one of the few that has like a number of options you might look up, but realistically, you're only going to use 3 of them. And those could have been there. They really could have listed them. So let's actually take a look at the Lich for a second. So 2014, you can see, is kind of a mess, right? What it's trying to do, and I love what it's trying to do, is trying to say the Lich is a spellcaster. In fact, it is an 18th level wizard. So it therefore has the exact number of slots as an 18th level wizard, because this is real. And so we've got cantrips, and we've got first level spells with 4 slots, and second, and so on. What it means is you got to look up, like, I don't know what this is, 20 spells, like some huge number you got to look up and figure out what they all do and how they work tactically. And what often would happen with a lot of these spell lists is you have multiple spells that may, especially the defensive ones, that require concentration, but offensive as well. So you've got to look up, oh wait, is Cloud Kill concentration? And oh, is my Globe of Invulnerability? Is my Dimension Door? Is my, you got to look this all up and see, like, can I be invisible and have Globe of Invulnerability up? You have to look that all up. And if the answer is yes, now you've got to choose one or the other, hopefully before battle starts, or we're going to be having the lamest battle as you look everything up and feel uncertain about your actions, right? So you're going to need a whole nother piece of paper to write what this Lich does. in addition to the fact that you have its action, its attack, and then you have its rejuvenation, its legendary resistance, its legendary actions, right? This is a lot to deal with. Looking at the 2025 Lich, it's a little better. So the stat block condenses down to, what is that, 5, 6 lines. Still a fair bit, but a lot of these spells I don't have to worry about the detect magic and detect thoughts unless I'm out of combat. And I get down to a couple like Dispel Magic, Fireball, Invisibility, Lightning Bolt. And then I have some that are more powerful once per day each. Chain Lightning, Finger of Death, Power Word, Kill. I would say the Lich is a pretty tactical thing. When I'm fighting a Lich, it's almost always an end boss. If you're running a campaign where Liches are just whatever, taking out the trash in the dungeon, well, that would be a whole other kind of campaign anyway. But in general, this is a boss, right? And so I'm okay with some amount of homework here. But you will have to look these up, right? And you're going to find that Chain Lightning absolutely should be one of the things that you should do. But Finger of Death versus Power Word to Kill, there's a better one there. And then you have to compare that against the multi-attack. So we were talking about, general topic of spell lists and going back to one path leads to CR. The truth is, for the Lich, you need to do some work to see what it should use. Whether it should, when it should, which spells it should use. You could, because you might wonder, should I just cast 3 times? If I have 3 rounds where I'm alive, is it all casting? Or is my multi-attack going to beat out on these options? And what should I do and how? So there's a lot here to parse, right? There's a lot of tactical richness here. And I wish that we just had a bit less here, because as I said, you don't need all of these offensive abilities. So just tell me, hey, it's Fireball and it's Chain Lightning, and maybe give me like Power Word Kill or something like that, because it's kind of really impressive. And then let's be done. We don't need all these options. Or give me information in the side of other utility spells or protective spells that Liches tend to have that I can swap in to make it different, right? Give me 4 different stat blocks. One that's more defensive, one that's more about cat and mouse type play, and one that's just all tear it up. And let me choose which one I want. And don't just make lists of spells, but actual stat blocks of those spells with abbreviations. That would be super cool. This monster manual is in alphabetical order, sort of. So alphabetical order in the 2024 edition means a few things. They have worked hard to say, if this is the name of a monster, then it appears alphabetically. But if it's a type of that name of a monster, then it appears altogether under that name. So goblin is a monster, but there are different kinds of monsters. There are different types of goblins, so they all appear grouped under goblin. Modrons all have the name Modron kind of in front of it. So, and sometimes they make it seem a little silly, like the monodrone or the duodrone now are called Modron monodrone, Modron duodrone, so that it makes sense that we've forced them together, or it just reinforces that concept, right? An example of where this isn't true is Beholder. So we have the Beholder under B, as you would expect. In the past, we had the Death Tyrant as an undead Beholder, but because that isn't really a Beholder, it's a different creature that comes from a Beholder that's undergone a process. Death Tyrant appears under D. And the Undead Beholder in both versions appears under Zombie, or because it's a Beholder, Zombie is its name, right? And that is, my thing is, it's still confusing at the end of the day. They have tried a kind of way to clarify it. It works in some cases, it doesn't in others, right? I found myself preferring that the Death Tyrant would have been next to the Beholder, because as a DM, what I'm often doing is building encounters, coming up with ideas. And so I actually would like all 3 of those Beholders to be there as things that happen to Beholders. And that would have been cool. Mephits are all together. And I would say a Steam Mephit is not a type of mud Mephit. They're not, there is no Mephit of which these are side types. They are all differences, and they're all Mephits. The way that giants are all giants, but aren't a sub-giant, right? Well, mephits get the treatment of being gathered all together. Giants don't. They're all spread out. The Marid, Dao, Jin, Efreeti are all spread out. And there are a couple things that happen. One is that you might have some trouble piecing it together, though they make up for it with an appendix. I'll talk about that. But the other thing that happens is that you lose that cool big section that talked about the lore of how these things fit together. So we don't have a big space with giants that talks about the Ordling and giant culture as it did in 2014. Instead, we get these little pieces that address things. Same thing with dragons, with devils, with demons. We get these individual bits around the individual fiend or dragon that tell us things. And listening to the designers talk about this, I feel like, they said, oh, you can really sense how the multiverse shapes the dragons. And I think it's something where they know that, but I don't think a new DM would read through this and really come up with that to the extent that, say, you do in Fizzbands, or that you would if you had put all the dragons here and written about how to use dragons in your campaign. Also worth noting that this book doesn't do a lot of how-to, it does a lot of lore. I'll touch on that a bit later on. Sphinxes are grouped. I think that's good. It's better that they're grouped together. So these things where there are groupings and they pays off, to me says that, I don't know. I don't know that I appreciate this change here. I think I'd rather have things grouped the way they were in 2014. It's not the end of the world. They do try to make up for it with the appendix, but it's just a thing that has changed. And I think not as good. So other quick items. The art in this book is great. I mean, it's beautiful art, superb artists. It is, like a lot of the 2024 edition, a little more sort of like happy, bright colored versus like thrilling, exciting. I think it has done a good job of sort of stepping away from a male art perspective. I showed this to a couple of my friends who weren't gamers, and they were like, oh, wow, neat. And they really liked the art, right? And that to me ultimately is what matters. If new players pick this up and think, oh, wow, cool, this is neat, I want to page through this, great. It doesn't have to be for me. That's fine. I'm already playing this game and loving it. One thing that I thought was really funny is what's the difference between a female Marilith in 2014 and a male Marilith in 2025? Skincare. Yep. It really, put some lotion on that, bro. There was also a push in the art to try to make the art of the game tell a little more about Dungeons and Dragons. So like try to depict monsters within their world. And I didn't find that this was a huge difference, but it's a little better. Like the Mimic tries to show off that there are lots of kinds of Mimics. That doesn't just have to be a treasure chest while still having that treasure chest. Why is a Mimic a treasure chest? We always think of it that way because of the original art from the way back Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, and everybody feels like they can't change away from it. So this does a nice job of breaking that out, showing the options, how you can have a room full of mimics. Is the room a mimic? Great stuff. A green dragon that's going underneath a canoe and is going to come up. That's awesome. What else? We've got Lamia, who are in a desert environment, just showing different types of play. So overall, I think this is a nice thing. It's a good goal that they tried to sort of reinforce what D&D is through the art and show monsters in action, interacting in ways that they kind of haven't before. I think that's pretty cool. Legendary actions, the team had toyed with the idea of removing them and making them reactions. I'm glad to see legendary actions back. They are generally easier to run and streamlined. There aren't so many layer actions. They tend to more fall back on the idea that legendary actions, you get 4 when you're layer versus 3 outside is the typical way it works. But I think that's fine. That they're generally fun. They do add to the DPR of these monsters. I haven't compared one legendary creature against the other, 2014 versus 2025, but from what I can tell, these monsters all look really effective that have legendary actions. So we have the appendices at the end, and this is pretty helpful. It's something that I actually, because I'd printed out a version of it and stuck it in my monster manual, I literally thought it was in the old monster manual. It was added to other books later, but it appears directly in here, and it's great. Appendix B is, or Appendix A is going to be your animals. So this is what we had. We see some of this in the player's handbook, and then we also had this before, where we have just all the animals listed out, right? So if it's a regular cat or it's a dire bear, you know, something like that, then those all appear in there. We also have dinosaurs and a few other things. Some things have changed type, while most are beasts. We have some things that are like celestials because they decided their type should change for whatever reason. Fine, okay. Then in Appendix B, we get all of these other things. We get the monster conversions. That's just one page that shows things like, you know, for the orc, you now use a tough. For the orc war chief, it's a tough boss. The orog is a berserker. The drow is a priest acolyte. The quipper is a piranha, right? All of those, as we talked about before. The monsters by habitat are great. So things like, you know, what is in a desert? And you get all of them listed and sorted by CR, which is very helpful. The monsters by creature type alphabetically, so you can see all the constructs or all the monstrosities. I like that a lot. I do wish they had placed the CR next to these so that you could just quickly look at it. Like, here are all the constructs, and oh, look, there's one that I can use in my tier 2 game, right? That would be really helpful. But it's fine. The Modrons are listed individually, but then sometimes dragons get like black dragons all. There's a little inconsistency with how this is approached, but it's fine. No biggie. Monsters by group, so you can see what are all the giants, what are all the angels, and make sure you're not missing them. So that's a good one to remember, that this exists, right? That if you're looking for all of these, you can find them in groups. This is a place where you do get some help, right? For example, beholders are grouped, so we can see beholder, death tyrant, spectator, zombie, beholder, all in one place, whereas they appear all alphabetically, making them hard to locate. Did they capture all the types that you'd want? I don't know. At least they tried. And this is also helpful to remember, like, hey, if you're looking for something like a Titan or a Genie, you will find them listed here. We don't get page numbers, we don't get CRs, but at least you can now go back and look them up alphabetically in the book. 2-step process, but better than nothing. So after the monsters by group, we get monsters by challenge rating. And this is pretty handy too, right? Because sometimes you're just like, there should be something that is acting as the lieutenant for these goblins. What could it be? It should really be, you know, a CR1 creature. What are all my options? And you can just see them all, right? Or I want something really tough. They could face a CR5. Let's see what my options are and just see all of those. So that's pretty helpful too. So there you have it. Those are my main takeaways on the 2025 Monster Manual. As I said early on, it's a great book. It's overall a solid purchase. It's a good thing to buy, whether you get the regular cover or the special Monster Manual. This is a book that you're going to enjoy. You're going to like the art in it. You're going to like the words. You know, even where I can quibble about the lore not being as plentiful as it used to be, the art might not always be my style. I might find that I would swap out the tables for art. I might say that spell lists should be actions for a lot of these creatures when they're offensive spells. That there's some expertise here called on by the DM to think through how to use, especially area of effect and spell lists. Yeah, those things are all true to me, and you know, in my personal opinion, but it doesn't change from this being overall a good book, a really good book. They have made improvements throughout. Did everything need to get changed to this extent? No. Honestly, they could have really given me a monster manual that would have been 90%, 75% what was in 2014, because that was great, and just made some improvements where actually needed. But they went the whole the whole distance, and they updated all. Every single monster gets tweaks, and so hopefully that is better for it. So hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters who make this possible. If you'd like to join us, come on over. You can check the links down below on how to join our Discord, how to be part of our Patreon, how to support me, the products that I provide. They are other ways that you can support me. You can also find those on the Patreon page or on my website at alphastream.org. And I'll see you next time as I dig further into the fun part of these monsters.